right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, New Insights on Household Food Waste. I'm Ria Marshall. I am the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. So thank you. I'm sure I see some new faces and some new names coming on to our webinar series. Our presenters today are going to be Dr. Brian Rowe, the Van Buren Professor in the Department of Agricultural Environment and Development Economics at The Ohio State University, and Dr. Brenna Ellison, Director for the Center for Food Conservation and Waste Reduction, and a professor at Purdue University. I won't say the Purdue University, but Purdue University. Next slide, please, Brian. Our next webinar will be April 16th. It's titled Beyond Auction, Social Impacts of Nebraska Livestock Sale Barns by folks at the University of Nebraska. So we hope you can join us. Just as a reminder, we are recording the webinar. If you have questions along the way, you can put them in the chat. We'll have the presenters, each will do 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. But you can go ahead as we go along and put questions in the chat. I'll try to remember to scroll up when it's time for the Q&A. And again, welcome all. And with that, Brian, it's all yours.
Thanks, Maria. Really a pleasure to be here today and talk to this group. Today, I want to talk about some interesting policy analysis that was led by Ren Lee. She's a faculty member at Penn State University, and this was a large portion of her dissertation. And I'm as the second author. I was also her advisor when she was at Ohio State University, but excited to talk about some of this path-breaking research that she's really led. This is funded with monies out of an NSF grant that's funded the Recipes Network. This is a sustainable regional network grant offered by NSF to focus on regional food systems through the lens of wasted food. And this topic is very much in line with the spirit of that grant. So this really focuses on climate change and food waste. We all know that global food system emissions are increasingly scrutinized as part of trying to meet climate targets globally. California in particular sees a lot of this on the ground with flash fires and fires that have been throughout the state of California, causing major issues on the ground, oftentimes attributed to shifting weather patterns consistent with some of the climate change models. Now, food loss and waste account for, by some calculations, about half of global food systems emissions. And particularly methane arises when food and other organic materials are placed in landfills that are not appropriately managed. And it's the number one material in most US landfills, accounting for typically over 20 to 25%, in California, almost half of landfill content. And so Californians saw landfills and organic materials as a key way to address methane emissions, specifically in the state of California, which led them to develop a state organic waste law. And this is part of a larger state level initiatives across the country, thinking about bans and recycling focused on organic waste. Many states have bans on commercial entities placing organic materials into landfills, at least of certain sizes or certain locations. In fact, we've got 9 different states that have some form of a ban or reduction on commercial organic disposal. A recent Science article looked at 5 of these and found that 4 out of the 5, seemingly according to their assessment, did not have much of an effect. The Massachusetts one seemed to be the one that stood out in that analysis. There's been less analysis, at least, on residential food waste bans. And so this is where California comes in. Although it was a broader bill, their focus on residential food waste efforts was kind of a distinguishing factor of this Senate Bill 1383, SB 1383, coming out of California. They invested nearly $500 million on infrastructure grants and loans to support this bill. Interestingly, as they did their assessments back in 2016, when this bill was being passed, they assumed that the ban itself would not change household food waste behaviors. And this is something we'll look at specifically in this analysis. And there's been a lot of back and forth on, whether or not this bill is accomplishing what they hope it will, going so far as having the Little Hoover Commission in California kind of recommend a pause in the policy, which was not followed through on. But there's been some interesting conversations about this in the state of California. And so this researcher we're looking at really looks at that key question: will residential food waste bans actually affect behavioral behaviors surrounding food waste in homes in California? To give you an idea of some of these organic waste recycling laws that focus on the household, here's a map put forward by a group called ReFed, Rethinking Food Waste Through Economics and Data, probably a leading NGO focused on food waste. And so you can see there are multiple states that have various types of policies focusing on this, and then the circles there represent individual cities across the United States that have some type of policy. And so these started dropping back in the early 2020s with Vermont, and we'll be focusing on the California efforts, which started in January 1 of 2022, and other states with state of Washington coming online here in that not too distant future of 2027. So Senate Bill 1383 is their implementing legislation. Every jurisdiction must provide organic waste collection services to all residents and businesses. And that means people have to get a green bin or fill a green bin, or the municipality has to have another approach for dealing with organic material. But most people are seeing green bins where they had not seen them before. That is, bins where they have to put organic material, including wasted food and food scraps. This again started with the adoption back in 2016, but had a very long lead-in period with it taking effect in January 1 of 2022. And by the end of 2023, over 75% of communities had residential organic waste collection in place. So let's put ourselves in the mind of some of those Californians. Maybe you're on the call, maybe you are here from California yourself. You can see if this is your thought process, right? You get the postcard in the mail. This is what Cal Recycling sent out to residents, saying, food scraps are bad. They cause all sorts of negative outcomes. Instead, let's do something good with those food scraps, put them into your green bin, and we can make compost and energy. And so you're thinking to yourself, one more thing to do, right? I have to now, if wasn't previously doing this, I have to sort and store and then take out yet another bin from the curbside. And so that's going to take some time. Where do I get that time from? Do I steal that away from family time? Do I take it out of my leisure activities? Or am I kind of stuck? I've only got so much kitchen time. Do I kind of steal that away from other parts of my kitchen routine? And so that got us thinking about, I wonder how that affects people's decisions around food waste, particularly that prep time, right? Can be time where you might be sorting and storing your products, maybe trying to make sure you don't waste as much food. So we wondered if this might have a knock-on effect on food waste in the household. And so we looked through the literature, and there wasn't a lot of evaluation on how these types of programs affect food waste behavior. A little bit of indirect evidence out of Australia, kind of hinting at, but not directly assessing. They found that after some of these proposals went into effect, green bin recycling went up more than the red bin, or the overall bin went down. And some other indirect evidence from the United States. Jackson Summers and some of his colleagues at UConn looked at some of those city level recycling programs and bans across the US, and they found an increase in food expenditures, which could be consistent with additional food waste, but they don't look at that specifically. So we see this effort as being kind of a first true evaluation of actual whether or not these policies affect food waste behavior. And then there really haven't been any environmental impact assessments. And so we're going to look at some environmental impact assessments of this as well, based upon the results. Also in the literature, not a lot of investigation on kind of the spillover effects to other activities. A few out there. So some municipal level, some household level, looking at both voluntary and mandatory programs, mainly from outside of the US. One did a bit of a deeper dive in one single city in California a few years back, and then that piece by Summers and colleagues looked at multiple US cities as well, looking at recycling waste, overall waste, food waste, and food purchasing as some of those other knock-on effects. So we think this also contributes to that literature. Let's take a quick look at the data. The National Food Waste Tracking Survey is this NSF-funded effort. It's this two-part online survey that goes out 3 times a year out of our shop here at Ohio State, based on a validated approach that had been tested in Europe, adapted for our US audiences by myself and some colleagues, and then ran the first author of this effort, summarized some of that data in a paper that came out in 2023. Basically, this goes out, there's a baseline survey, we grab some demographics, and then we tell people to pay attention over the next 7 days to the types of food that you might be discarding. Doesn't matter if you're tossing it down the sink, in the trash, compost, feed it to your pet, whatever. Kind of pay attention to that. We're not interested in bones, pits, peels, etc. So we're really looking at those once edible items. Come back a week later, and then we have them marked down in up to 24 categories, foods that they might have discarded in the past 7 days. And then we drill down and have them tell us about the quantities in each of those. So we get consumer panelists from commercial vendors who manage consumers who like to take surveys from across the country. And we screen out for adults who are responsible for at least half of their home food prep to make sure people have an idea of what's actually being wasted in their home. And you can see here we've had this going on since early 2021, and we're continuing to collect it as of today. This data we're looking at goes from 21 through the end of 2023. During that time period, we had over 1,000 observations coming out of California, and then any number of observations coming from across the US. So to really use that data to test these effects, we have a lot of things we like. We've got coverage before the bill went into effect in January 1 of 2022. So we've got 3 waves before that, 6 waves after that. We've got coverage in California and the rest of the states, and we've got these repeated cross sections. We don't get the same people every wave, so it's known as a repeated cross section. And that means we can use some statistical techniques that are really good for these purposes, known as difference in difference, so the difference between California and other states, and the difference before and after. And we also then lean into some other statistical approaches to make sure that those non-California folks look like the Californians in all other ways, education, income, etc., to make sure we have a balance of like-looking people from across the United States and California. And this is known as a doubly robust difference in difference approach that's been used quite heavily in the literature at this point. Quick look at our data here from our National Food Waste Tracking Survey and the census. We've got a few differences from the US Census, a little more female focused, not too surprising given our screening on food handling, which is still, for the most part, female dominant in the US. A little bit heavier in terms of a little more formal education in this group, a few more folks with a bachelor's degree than less than a bachelor's degree than the census, and a little bit heavier on folks in the lower income brackets in our survey rather than the census. Let's take a look at the main result. Here we're looking at how did the amount of food waste reported by these consumers on these surveys change over time in California versus those kind of other people outside of California who look like the Californians, but were in other states without this policy. And this graphic going from left to right basically shows the statistical approach back in that last wave before it went into effect, zeroes out that difference and takes the kind of the baseline of California minus other states being exactly equal, equalizes that, and then looks at every other wave looking for the effective difference between California and other states in terms of the total amount of food that they're discarding in a given 7-day period. And what you see is before that went into effect, those first 3 bars, those are all pretty small numbers. And that graphic of the bar covers the 0 line, which means it's not really different than 0. Moving to the right of that, we see lots of bars that are above the zero mark, and those stars suggest statistically significantly different than zero. Overall, over those 6 periods, we see that the average effect of that bill was that Californians were wasting about 139 grams per person per week, or about 39% more discarded food in their homes than comparable households outside of California. And again, this controls for demographics and other things that are observable about households. So we're not pitting, maybe higher educated Californians with lesser educated people from other states. We control for all those items. And so this is a big effect, a 39% bump in self-reported food waste in California after the bill versus before the bill compared to other states. We did a little pushing on this to make sure we felt comfortable that there might not be some type of reporting artifact. And we have different categories of food that we track. Liquids aren't going into that green bin. And so we went and validated that indeed there was no difference in liquid waste before and after this went into effect in California. So it's all because of the solid foods that would be put into a green bin and not your milk and juice and other items that might be discarded down a sink. And so we do feel pretty confident that this is going on. But we went a little bit further and we said, well, if there's more food waste, there's probably more food being purchased as well to create that more waste. And so we went to an entirely different data source. This is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, their consumer expenditure study. This is the data that the US government uses, for example, to help figure out how to weight different items in the consumer price index. So a very highly regulated and scrutinized data set. And they go and they look, they have a 1 week diary that has households go back and talk about all their expenditures, food, clothes, services, everything like that. So a very robust data set. And when we looked in this and did that same type of statistical analysis, we found that sure, all those years before the bill went into effect, Californians and our matched groups outside of California, basically no difference in food purchasing. As soon as 2022 and 2023 come along, though, we see a bump up in the amount of food being purchased by Californians compared to those very similar households outside of California. In fact, that turned out to be on average about $14 more per person per week, or about a 26% increase in food expenditures in California than others. Now, Jackson Summers and his colleagues did something similar about a decade and a half earlier. They looked at bans going back from 2004 up to 2020, and they found about an 8% increase in food spending among citizens of those municipalities that had an organic waste ban or something similar compared to others using Nielsen data. So we still wanted to figure out what's going on here. So we went one step further and we looked at time use. And interestingly enough, the federal government has this really great data source called the American Time Use Survey, where they have people sit down and articulate minute by minute every over a day or two, what are they doing at every minute of the day? And they have this category for kitchen and food cleanup. And this means cleaning up after a meal, cleaning up plates and food, cleaning freezer, throwing away leftovers, all these things that would be taken up if you had to comply with a brand new SB 1383 and had to sort out your food waste at the end of meals or at the end of the week. And we can see as we look again, rest of the US in blue here in this graphic, California in orange, that sure enough, pretty similar. People are spending about 7, 8 minutes a day, kind of an uptick during COVID and early post-COVID. But then in 22, Californians bumped up by about a couple of minutes a day in terms of their time use spent in cleaning up the kitchen compared to, again, comparable households in other states. And when we look at that data, it turned out to be about 2.3 additional minutes per person per day, or about a 20%, 28% increase in the time that people spent in the kitchen because of this bill. So this bill is really having big effects. It seems to be increasing food waste. Food waste seems to be coming from more food purchases, and people, perhaps what they're doing is they're spending more time cleaning up and maybe spending less time on the preparation side, which it might be where they might have been preventing food waste before. when we kind of do some simple back of the envelope estimates of how this affects get greenhouse gas emissions, we find that this bill actually does, if all this food waste is being diverted by SB 1383 out of the landfill and into something less impactful, it does reduce methane emissions by about 18%, according to the kind of most popular or most um, calculation that we have here. But if you look at all those greenhouse gas emissions that go into creating the more food that's being purchased by those households and then wasted, the total greenhouse gas emissions, thinking about all the methane across the entire supply chain and all of those CO2 equivalents being produced during the production phases of this, we find that the overall would be about a 21% increase in those total greenhouse gas emissions. So it's meeting the narrow constructs of the goals of the bill by reducing methane. This is a methane specific bill in California, but kind of missing the bigger picture in terms of the total greenhouse gas emission equivalents being created. So in summary, um, this bill has some pretty big impacts. Almost a 40% increase in household food waste, almost a 30% increase in food expenditures, and almost 2.5 minutes of time per day per person being spent additional on kitchen and food cleanup. So this has implications, right? While this meets that kind of narrow focus of methane, it seems to be missing the bigger picture in terms of total CO2 emissions, which really suggests that you may need to foster, if you're thinking about types of these policies for your own state, or as California considers moving forward and this as well, may need to foster kind of voluntary engagement and kind of stimulate intrinsic motivation here to be able to maybe reduce some of these unexpected side effects of this. In fact, Summers finds that when the cities implemented a voluntary versus a mandatory program, they found a smaller effect in their studies. And there may need to just be an incorporation of a complementary waste prevention effort, because so many of those emissions come from the food being produced, and only about 7% of those emissions really come from putting it in the landfill. And then considering the time constraints as well might be really useful to help think about how we can temper expectations around that. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Brenna, I believe, who is going to um, present next.
Hello, everyone. I am excited to be here as well. Let me make sure you can see the screen. It's not. Can you see it? Okay. So I'm Brenna Ellison. I am the director for the Center for Food Conservation and Waste Reduction here at Purdue. And I think Brian gave me a great segue into my presentation. He talked about kind of the voluntary engagement and intrinsic motivation. And we'll actually be talking about a project where we're trying to leverage that among households in Indiana. So we are talking about consumer-driven approaches to improving household food management and reducing waste. Before I jump in, though, I do just want to, if you're new to our center, I just want to give a quick introduction. And so here's what we're trying to do at the Center for Food Conservation and Waste Reduction. We have funding support from USDA, and kind of the aim of our center is to work with households to reduce food waste and improve nutrition security. And then we also have a mandate to engage the next generation in food waste reduction. So we have programs for college students that we're working with across 4 states. But on the household side, some of the ways that we are accomplishing this is we have an established website, conservefood.org. Please feel free to check it out. And one feature on that website is a resource library where we're curating existing resources. And in the long run, we hope to be developing our own. But this is designed for households or people who work with households, whether that be an extension, education, other things. These are resources designed to help households improve their food management behaviors, and that's across the entire continuum. So I just show here the menu in which you can filter the resources that we have. We have almost 200 resources so far. And also a plug that if you know of a resource we are missing, please send it our way. We like to add new resources every month in our newsletter. So just keep us in mind if you have something new you want us to talk about. Um, so as I mentioned, we're also piloting tailored interventions to conserve food and reduce waste. So we're looking for more of that voluntary engagement. While our center is supported by USDA funding, this particular project would not be possible without some funding from the Purdue Ag Seed Program, which attempts to fund interdisciplinary projects and work with Extension. And so I also want to shout out a big thank you to our partners in Purdue Extension who helped us with recruitment and finding locations to meet with participants across the state, and also for helping us come up with intervention ideas. Okay, so I think with this group, we probably know, and Brian covered it a little bit, but why target households? We know food waste happens across the supply chain. However, households do seem to be one of the places where we're generating the most. And so this is also from ReFed and just a quick illustration of why households are where we're targeting our energy. But then I want to maybe spend a bit more time making a case for tailored interventions. So as households are the top contributors of food waste, like this is something we know, but they are very different in their food management behavior. So we can't treat them all the same, right? And some of the current initiatives at the state or federal level, the initiatives to reduce food waste sometimes are top down in nature or take a more one size fits all approach. So as an example, we have lots of education efforts around date labeling, and that's important. We know there's a lot of confusion among consumers about date labeling. But when we have a kind of specific focus on date labeling, we might be missing other areas where consumers need help. So in this project, we're aiming to take a more personalized approach, and we allow households to self-select their own intervention to try and better manage their food and reduce waste at home. So our hope here is exactly what Brian was getting at. So we want, to improve buy-in and follow through. So kind of get that intrinsic motivation, and also to allow households to optimize based on their own environment and behavior. So we think households probably know what they need best, and we let them actually choose that and try to remove some of the financial risk of experimenting with something new in your household food management routine. So I'm going to give a quick overview of our study design. So we have a randomized control design with approximately 120 Indiana households across 5 kind of metropolitan or suburban areas in Indiana. And so what we did is for all the households in the study, they first came in person with us and they did a baseline household food management survey. And then we trained them on a protocol to do a 5-day food waste audit at home. And so as part of this audit, we had them enter data through an app called XBWell that was developed by a professor in psychology here at Purdue. And essentially, this is a log they can do at home through their app. They had a scale, they had measuring cups, things like that. So this is not an estimation of waste. This should be, actual weighing and tracking of their waste. So on the first day of the waste audit, they do what we call a kitchen check. And so that's kind of looking through their kitchen and seeing, is there moldy cheese or things that we know aren't going to be eaten that we should go ahead and record now, in the hopes that we've kind of established, kind of clear out the kitchen for what we know won't be eaten. And then the following 4 days are intended to be kind of regular days of how much waste is getting generated. And at the end of the 4th day, we do one last kitchen check just to make sure, we've got what we need. So all households do this. And then we randomize people into either a treatment or a control group. So for our treatment group, once they completed their 5-day food waste audit, we asked them to schedule a one-on-one interview with someone from the research team. So typically that was myself or Karen Bird, who works with me at the center, and I think she's on the call. So we did a lot of one-on-one interviews. And in that process, we essentially asked households things like, how much did you pay attention to waste prior to the study? Would you say your recording period was typical of how your household normally behaves? What did you learn about, how your household manages food? Were there patterns in your waste? And then we really focused on, what do you think would help your household reduce food waste? And so we tried to help the participants self-identify ways they could improve managing their food at home. And then we let them pick their interventions, and I'll talk more about the options there in a moment. They could pick one or more interventions, and we asked them to try them out for 30 days. And then we did a follow-up 1 month later, and they did the same survey and same 5-day food waste audit. For our control group, they just essentially had a 30-day holding period. They knew there would be a follow-up time in a month, and they went through the same survey and 5-day food waste audit again. Now, we did not want the control group to be left out and not get a chance to improve managing food at home. So we actually have them getting a delayed treatment where they went through the same interview and intervention selection process once their kind of second round survey and audit were completed. Okay, and so intervention selection. So when you're letting people self-select, you kind of need to come up with some ideas of what they might be interested in to begin with. So we kind of built our own catalog or menu, if you will, of interventions. And we did this in cooperation with Purdue Extension educators to think about, different options across the food management continuum. So we thought about, what are resources that could help with shopping, meal planning, meal prep and cooking, storage, disposal, like even thinking about composting if you want to try home composting, or just even educational guides about how to get started composting. We also had participants, like they had the option to go off list. And one of the favorite parts that I have about this intervention, when participants went through the interview, like we essentially told them they have a budget of up to $100 that they could spend to pick their intervention items. What was super interesting to me is you might think people are just going to maximize and try to spend the whole $100, but that's not actually what we found. There were people who took full advantage of the budget available, but there were also some people that were happy to just get a PDF meal planning template and wanted to try that and didn't actually spend any money at all. But we thought this was a unique contribution of our design, is to actually give them a budget and remove the financial cost of experimenting and trying something new at home. So this is really early analysis. We just finished this late last fall, but I want to show the most common intervention types. This is among the treatment group. So you can see on average, there's about 3 items per person that were selected. Again, not all items necessarily had to cost money, but we did see people often choosing more than one, which might be a combination of like physical things as well as educational resources. So as you can see here, food storage was really common. Food storage could take different forms. So we had several people that were interested in a vacuum sealer to try to better preserve their food for freezer storage. Lots of individuals were interested in clear storage containers to help improve visibility of food, both in their refrigerator, but also maybe clear storage containers for pantry type items like cereals, crackers, things like that. Also things like silicone molds or any sort of storage, essentially. Storage was a really popular category. Food prep and cooking, we also had a select number of individuals who wanted actual appliances. So we had someone who wanted an Instapot, someone that wanted this immersion blender to help be able to blend up fruits, vegetables, and then freeze them to add in sauces, smoothies, things like that. And then there were also people who were just interested in, maybe they felt really efficient with the majority of their food, but were looking for creative ways to use scraps. So the scraps book from IKEA was a free resource we could provide, but there's also several other cooking with scraps books that we had available for people to look at as well. And then I would say kind of the third larger category was meal planning. So we did have some free meal planning templates available online that we found through organizations, but we also had several people that might be interested in trying a magnetic refrigerator board, like the one I have on this slide, that kind of helps you plan out what your week's going to look like. Some people also experimented with newer apps that would help you kind of track your kitchen inventory, meal plan, and like also generate ideas for recipes with what you could do with what's left in your house. So we had a broad a cross section of things that people were interested in. One category I don't have up here just because it was not I would say by volume or by number, a high category, but there were also individuals who, again, felt like they were doing a pretty good job managing food at home, but they had a lot of inedible waste. So I know Brian mentioned they weren't tracking the inedible waste. We did because through the auditing process, if what consumers are mostly generating is inedible, their potential solutions to managing food might be different than individuals who are generating mostly edible waste. And so in the case where people felt like it was mostly inedible, we did have a few that wanted help buying a home composter and getting educational resources on how to start composting at home. Okay, so far what we've evaluated is just like, what did participants think about their intervention? So out of almost 200 interventions selected, again, we're talking an average of almost 3 per person, 95% of those interventions were reported as implemented, which we're really happy with. We think that means, again, people pick things they were actually willing to try, which was the point of this particular intervention. For the few that were not implemented, it was typically a function of insufficient time. Individuals also felt that, ease of implementation was pretty high. So I have here kind of our average ease of implementation was 3.47. That's on a 4-point scale. And then perceived success of the intervention was also rated highly. So again, an average of 2.59 with a maximum of 3. So overall, people seemed to feel like the intervention was functioning the way as intended, at least from the research side. We also got some qualitative feedback just on how it went. So I won't read all of these, but I like to highlight them just to show you the wide array of things that people got. So in the top left, this was someone talking about silicone cube trays were a huge success for freezing milk. They said they only bought it for recipes, so they found themselves buying half gallons all the time and then throwing the milk away because it went bad. So they actually bought silicone molds that were in half cup portions, so they would have ready-made portions of milk to use in future recipes. Underneath that, it talks about the immersion blender being able to, again, help puree fruits, vegetables, things like that. But the one that I thought was interesting as someone who has kids at home, this particular person asked us to buy different colored drink bands. They had several kids at home and they noticed they had a lot of beverage waste with milk and juices. And so each kid got to pick their own color and that drink band would go on their cup and that helped them not have so much waste. We also had people that say they used it and they weren't perfect. So you can see at the top, we had a whiteboard for planning. I wasn't perfect, but it was much better than the first part of the study. So again, incremental progress is still a good thing. And then the last one, just really makes my heart happy as a researcher to read. They essentially got a menu planning board and a vacuum sealer. It said, together they made our kitchen more organized, budget-friendly, and stress-free. And again, we want to help consumers stretch their food dollars and ideally reduce the amount of food going to the landfill. So this is early feedback, but we feel pretty promising. So I'll tell you a little bit more about, where we're going from here. So we have lots of data and we're still working on processing it. So some things that we want to look at going forward, did the interventions impact actual waste outcomes? So we have before and after food waste audits. So we can look and see, have we, reduced the quantity of waste? We also have measures related to satisfaction and confidence with food management. So we can see if interventions have improved those. We're also really interested to see if the intervention reduced stress. So on one quote, they specifically mentioned that. But we do have a perceived stress scale in the survey. So we are curious to see if we can reduce the stress of household food management. And then we're also interested in investigating whether or not this has any implications for food or nutrition security, which we also measure in the survey. Longer term questions we have are, how can we scale this intervention? We think it's pretty cool. And again, I think so much of our efforts to reduce waste can go a long way by just getting a household to track it for a few days and try to just increase that self-awareness, try to get that intrinsic motivation going. So how can we get people to just take a few days to see what's going on at home and kind of get their brain turning on what could be done different? And, again, how can we scale reducing the risk of experimentation for households? So those are some of the questions we're thinking about. I really appreciate the venue to share. And I'd be happy to take questions, or you can also reach out by email and we'd love to connect that way.
Thank you, Brenna. That was interesting. Interesting both for Brian and Brenna. I'm going to go way at the beginning of the chat. I know that there was quite a bit of chat going back and forth. And Brian, I know you've been answering some of the questions, but about this thing of having the bins actually make more waste. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's the research design was specifically to assess causality, right, of whether or not this actually caused that. And as economists, if you're, I forget, I don't know how many folks on the call are professionally trained economists versus not. This is something we spend a lot of time wringing our hands over. And so we feel uh, pretty confident that we have identified that, yes, it is the introduction of the policy in California that caused people to increase their food waste in that state. And because we do have this natural experiment of other states going through the same exact time path, but not having those policies implemented. We've done a lot of kind of testing. So yeah, it does appear that against what they had assumed when they were initially planning this back in the 2010s, that the policy did affect the way that people generate their waste in their homes.
Thank you. Brenna, there's a question for you from Lynn that says, was the idea of municipal composting considered?
So for this particular one, not necessarily. However, if we had someone that was interested in composting, but like couldn't, like we had people mention, like, I can't do this because I'm in an apartment building or something like that, given that we were working within the state of Indiana, if there was someone interested in that, we would look to see if there was like a place where you could drop your food scraps, if that was something they were interested in. So is there a municipal location? And we would share that education if that was something specifically they asked for. So again, we had a few households that were really interested in trying composting, and then a few that they just felt like their actual living circumstances didn't really allow it. So if that's what they wanted to pursue, we would try to find like options for them in the area that they lived.
Oh, great, thank you. And I think this is something that maybe both of you can answer. It's from Andrew. It says, I would love to know the role education plays. For example, if there's more education on how to reduce waste, how to utilize scraps, how to meal plan, what is the effect from education?
So I'm happy to take a stab, and I know Brian can say a lot about this as well. So I think education is so important, but it's so hard to design it when every household wants educated or maybe needs educated on a different thing. And so one way we were approaching education is to actually learn by doing and observing what's going on. And like maybe that will help you figure out what would be most helpful to be educated on in the first place. Something our center is looking to work on in the next year. We have some collaborators at University of North Carolina. We actually want to build a quick kind of food management quiz where we can kind of figure out the gaps that maybe people struggle with managing their food and actually point them to tailored resources from the resource library that might be helpful to them and evaluate like if education can be helpful in that way. So that's at least kind of some effort, some things we're thinking about in the education space, but I know Brian will have more too.
Yeah, we've done some very intensive, almost clinical types of interventions as well, where we we assign somebody an individual coach, and then they like interact with them almost daily over the week that they're involved in this, and do kind of a motivational interview. And so those can be highly effective, but we found that you can't sustain that for very long. And so most of the effectiveness that we found, and I'll drop a site into the chat here soonish with that study, really comes out in terms of plate waste and things that they can adjust on the fly during a week. It didn't really put a dent into things like their food preparation waste or their major clean out waste, because those are kind of longer term efforts, which is really great about Brenda's approach here. I think you're able to perhaps attack some of those deeper seated, longer lasting elements in the approach that you're doing. I think in the California context, education, I think part of the effect we're seeing is that there wasn't a strong education coupled with that introduction of that policy. And again, in California, they're going to roll out a brand new thing in a couple of months here, which is their AB 660, which is their date labeling bill in California, where they're going to switch all the date labels in California so that it has a more sensible phrasing of those date labels, which people have been calling for forever. Sadly, that legislation has no education built into that. So they're just going to change the date labels and not have any capacity to do any education. And we're setting ourselves up to evaluate that policy as well. And we're a bit fearful that that lack of education might kind of undermine the potential efficacy of the policy because you really need to couple those things together.
Great, thank you. There's another question that says, has anyone gamified household food waste tracking like they have done with commercial food prep food waste tracking?
I feel like I saw some people drop a link in the chat. I wasn't really sure. I'm not aware of too much, and I didn't get a chance to look at the links in the chat, but I think that's something that would be fun, and especially like a challenge even with kids at home, like getting them involved and helping them kind of understand. Like I think that's a really great way to think about it. But yeah, I'm personally not aware. I don't know, Brian, if you are.
I've seen some gamification in food waste, but it was mainly around, well, there's one study, but it was mainly about the education around it was gamified rather than the tracking of the waste. And then Hellman's Fridge Night mission is kind of a gamified, again, not around the tracking so much, but they really set it up as a challenge. Can you get one more meal out of your fridge in a given week by setting up a kind of a fridge night where you will use recipes and hopefully apply some Hellman's mayonnaise as part of your magic elixir that you create from leftover items. So I've seen gamification, but not necessarily about the tracking. But I'd be interested in seeing that link that was dropped in the chat because that looked pretty compelling.
Great, thank you. Okay, there's another one that says, I wonder how the composting study would compare to what the Mills has found. After 3 months, they see a 20% reduction in food waste, and sorry, wasted food with the same amount of use of the bin. I wonder if the positive feedback plays a role.
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot, that difference, right? And so again, this comes down to that voluntary mandatory issue, right? You've got the mill users are a highly self-selected group who are able to afford a very nice piece of equipment and are pretty motivated around kitchen things. And talking with the folks at Mill, they say that the really big thing that a lot of their consumers like is it takes away the smell of wasted food, and so they get rid of that visceral thing because once you put it in the mill, it dehydrates it, and so it has a lot of additional benefits. But yeah, it really does then through salience, getting people aware of what they're doing, giving them instantaneous feedback. So a bit of a gamification there because now they can track this dashboard on their phone about how much is going into the mill. They found some really impressive reductions in contributions to that device. And some of their survey work also suggests that that is showing up in food purchasing so that people are actually truly wasting less and buying less, which is exactly what you want to happen with that. And so, yeah, some very interesting distinctions, mandatory versus voluntary, self-selected versus blanket coverage of an entire state. So I think those are probably some of the differences.
Great. And Brenna, before there's another question for Brian, but before that, Brenna, I would like to ask, what is that app that basically you can put in your menu and then tells you what to do with the leftovers? I think a lot of us would like to know what that.
Oh, there's actually several. We have a blog post that talks about it. So I'm going to drop the blog post in the chat because we had a student for their undergrad research project try to do like consumer reviews of like pros cons of several apps. So I will put that in the chat for everyone.
Perfect, thank you. And Brian, you have another question says, did the GHG analysis of pre and post SB 1383 implementation include the GHGs emitted by producing the additional 139 grams of food waste per week? As in, was it cradle to grave GHGs?
Yeah, it was Cradle to Grave. We used the Refeds calculator on their site, which is Cradle to Grave. And it assumed that that SB 1383 was working perfectly. That is, if it was after it went into effect, we're assuming that everything got kept out of the landfill, which we know isn't true. So it was kind of a best case scenario there. And even under that best case scenario, we still saw greenhouse gas emissions kind of go up in net, but methane, and we do have a sensitivity analysis of that I can share with people who want to drill down. And under a broader range of, suppose only 75% of the things that went in the green bin actually got diverted, et cetera. We can show those numbers under those situations and scenarios.
Okay, great, thank you. And Jenny has a statement that says date labels, words don't really matter much. It's the date. We need to take the whole thing off packaging.
Yeah, we have a study where we did eye tracking, and people they really look at the date and not the phrases. So yeah, it is really about that, and that's part of our tracking that we're doing in California. That we're going to make sure to see if, for example, there are any changes to if any of the producers then change the horizon on their date label. That is, if they used to put a 14-day date after packaging, if they now shorten that to like 12 days after the change in the phrases to see if there are any other kind of unexpected changes going on with that. So we'll
I
see.
will say something on that topic that's just interesting out of all the interviews we did. And again, like we did, almost 100 of them. Um, no one ever brought up date labels as something they need help with. So I thought that was also interesting. Like they didn't bring up like I'm confused about it. And it could be because they just focus on the date. And again, they're not worried about the words, but like I can't remember it coming up even once that was something where they said like they needed help or even
But you have a
necessarily.
motivated group, right? That's a group that's pretty involved with food, right? So they probably know their way around that to some extent.
Possibly, yeah. So I will say, I do think there were definitely some people that were really interested, and it was definitely heavily female, and also pretty educated. Income spectrum was pretty even. But we also were giving out $100 incentive, and they didn't know about the $100 like spending. So it was actually, I think there was also quite a bit of financial motivation for some people because we asked them to do quite a bit of work. But point well taken, definitely some self-interested characters in there, but that was not something we heard a lot about in our set of interviews.
Great. And then Jennifer has a statement that says, I don't know which is worse, legislation without education or legislation requiring education without funding or a plan to implement. I think a lot of us here would be like, yeah, we agree. Let's see, let me get down here. I don't see any other. Please continue to put it, questions or statements in the chat. We have a few more minutes for questions. Don't see anything popping up at the moment. Are there any last minute, 1 or 2 minute things, Brian or Brenna, that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I'll note that in about this time next year, there will start to be introduced across the country PSAs and other advertisements as part of a national food waste reduction campaign. This was being funded as part of a large EPA contract that was fulfilled in the last year, and they'll be working with the ad firm that created the original Macintosh computer ad way back in the last millennium, but a very strong firm. And as part of that, there'll be tracking of the effectiveness of this. And they're also going to be inviting um, uh, proposals from different localities to implement the campaign more intensively in their particular community and then to evaluate that. So if people are interested to work with their local municipalities to possibly be one of those test cases communities, be on the lookout for an RFA coming out probably over the summer or fall, as they will look for communities that will implement this campaign and look for evaluation. Excuse me.
Great.
Yeah. Again, we just are excited for the opportunities to tell more about our center. And so if there are ways we can collaborate or help amplify great work that you all are doing, we would just welcome that opportunity. And again, like really finding resources that will help people. So that is our goal. The other thing I would note from the food waste data that we have started analyzing, something that's been really interesting is in our sample, like very, very big chunks are the inedible waste. So I do think like what we decide to measure and the solutions that we need are, it's interesting to actually track both edible and inedible. I think people were surprised at how much inedible there was, and they're like, what are we supposed to do with it? And so I think the efforts to try to get people to do municipal composting and things are really important, and getting the right framing around it to where we don't have those kind of rebound effects that Brian has observed as well. So that's just something that's been really interesting on our side. So
Great, thank you. Thank you both. This has been such an interesting webinar. I think the discussion in the chat definitely says that. You guys did a fantastic job. Thank you all so much. And we look forward to seeing you all at our April webinar, just April 18th. Thank you again so much. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next month.